say love and hate are very close. So I like playing with that, and the colour of love is red, and the colour of hate is red, and the colour of trust, you might say, is gold or yellow or something, and the colour of fear might be yellow as well. So it's quite interesting that, for me, to challenge people in a setting where they say, I hate you, and you say, you know that physiologically there's no difference between hating and loving somebody. So in fact, just change the context, and what you've just said is that I love you.
So a lot about that in psychoanalytic literature, I think.
Is there?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, certainly the investment involved in hating someone might be sort of in the same direction anyway as other investments in that degree of social engagement.
I just wanted an expert, because I've been pretending to be an expert on neuroscience and saying that the physiology is exactly the same. It's just you that decides. And I just want you to
I think that argument's too simplistic. What also differs is the facial expressions, and there's a whole. I mean, I've been focusing on internal body states, but there's a whole literature about facial feedback, and there's more complexity also in the facial expressions that don't have to be reciprocated social expressions, but can be generated by the computer upsetting you or something similar. I think so one of my researchers called it a monolithic model of arousals is a bit inaccurate, and there's a great deal more organ specificity and complexity to the patterning of body responses. But as we discussed, that a lot of individual differences in that, and people can be quite personal in the responses that they feel and the expressions that appear in their body.
So Hugo, you were mentioning about how the emotions would be somewhat, if you like, they would be potentially differentiated in the face, but just a moment ago Tina was mentioning that in many of her experiments that people wouldn't emote if it was one-on-one or just one person watching a film. So there seems to be this idea that people's facial expressions are more likely to emote in social circumstances, whereas they're more likely to remain blank, if you like, whether in one-on-one or experimental circumstances. And I guess the question is, are they actually emoting, but they have they have either display rules that they remain blank when they're alone, or they're just not emoting when they're actually watching the film by themselves? Is it just not a successful stimulus until you bring in more people?
I think there's a cultural overlay to that. I mean, I illustrated a Japanese set of experiments where people who would normally perhaps hide their emotions in social circumstances being filmed, but not knowing they're being filmed and not knowing that other people are going to watch their responses, seem to be liberated from that restraint that they impose themselves. I think laughter and contexts like that are also socially, culturally triggered, so I think people do intrinsically express the emotion. The degree to which it's visible might be determined by other factors, and I think that's true from facial expressions. The data on micro movements with the high-speed camera stuff was predated by muscle measurements, electrical impulse measurements from facial muscles that are involved in facial expressions, and that literature showed that people would generate automatic facial expressions, or at least tension in the muscles would increase in a measurable way, although you may not be able to see it in the right muscles, even to stimuli that you were presented subliminally, so you weren't aware that you saw an angry face. You could still measure responses in the kind of frowning muscles and so forth to those stimuli, using very sensitive electrical measurements.
Yeah. I'm just wondering why you call it chameleon. I mean, I think maybe it leads on what Hugo was just saying. Like, chameleon's quite a loaded term in itself, because it talks about disguise and blending in and.
Hello, and hello, Harry. Well, I think that's what we do generally. I mean, we're always adjusting to everything around us constantly, and making changes about how we interact with that. So in one sense, I guess it's basically just exactly what's sort of going on. You know, just this constant change and adaptation to the environment that you're in.
But I think at the same time, like, there seems, in the way you talk about it, that you seem, you know, you are looking for some sort of truth of emotion, or some sort of, you know, emotion that's, you know, stripped back and sort of vulnerable, but at the same time, you're saying, well, we are all chameleons, and we're never really showing our true emotion.
I guess when I started at the Institute of Neurology, I was very much interested in this sort of authentic emotion and trying to search for that, and then, you know, working with the hypnotists and creating all this really strong imagery. And then I sort of started to really think that actually, what does that mean? What is that, really, if you haven't got anyone to talk about it with and get a reflection from? It doesn't really mean much at all, and everyone has their own way of expressing that. So I guess I started to get more interested in how we deal with our emotions in social contexts. And I guess part of not using actors with creating the video database was also about that. That everyone, you know, some people, when I ask people to explore different emotional spaces just by acting out in front of the camera, for some people this was sadness, and that was happiness, and then we went into anger, and for them that was it, and it was exactly how, and it felt very, you know, I think it's a very loaded term to use, authentic anyway, but it felt very real. You know, like you know, some of that's a lot of the footage that I've used the most. And then some people were very much, you know, very, very expressive and eloquent about how that felt. And each was, you know, important, you know, in each. So I don't know if I've answered that question, but
I think I remember from the sort of early days of the application as well that Chris Frith, when he was talking about emotional contagion, it was about these changes that your facial expression goes through, and that he was referring to it as a kind of chameleon effect, and I think it came from that as well. And obviously things move on and develop, and so. But
we were dealing with emotions, but we're also dealing with emotional empathy. And I think then that puts a bit of different twist on it. How do we express empathy and feel empathy? And a lot of that is done through a sense of mimicry, of this sort of transference back and forth, this constant adaptation. You're feeling this and I'm feeling that, and then I'm responding to you like this, and then I want you to feel this, and then you know, sort of back and forth.
You mentioned that sometimes responses were a bit mundane, and you found that quite frustrating, that you were looking for something that had, I suppose, quite clear, definite and extreme response, which you felt was the minority of what you were recording. In your final pieces, or any of them work in progress, is it necessary to eliminate the mundane and just to take the extreme responses as the actual art piece? Because surely the nature of the project requires that the mundaneness of it is
important.
Part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that question first of all came up with an earlier sort of jury piece that I did, where I'd create this huge database, and I was just frustrated as an artist that it wasn't getting accessed, because, you know, it'd just be this little flicker that would come up occasionally, be like, oh no, but it'd be interesting there, you know, talk more like that. And I had no control. I guess it was my first piece that I had no control over it. You know, usually with if you're showing a video, a short film, a single channel, it just sort of does its thing, and it's going to do its thing, and you can trust that that's what you see. With interactive work, you never know where it's going to go and how people are going to experience for it. So with this piece, I mean, I think there are a few things going on. One is to engage an emotional response through something that isn't human. I mean, most people would do this piece using CGI, basically animated faces that would automatically go like that, which would be a lot easier because you're not dealing with time base and all the issues that go with that, and also you've got a lot more control over it. What you do have then is that whole uncanny valley thing. I'm not really going to relate to a cartoon character of a face. I want to see something of flesh, but we know that it isn't flesh. We're watching a screen. So in order to create an emotional response, in some ways you have to create something that is a little bit more intense than real life in order to do that.
But in the feedback responses, the ones that lack drama, would they be excluded as a result? I'm just talking about your...
How we choose the database. Actually, to choose that database, nothing's been edited. So whatever anyone's done for a neutral or sad, or I guess I've approached it quite ethnographically, that they've been in the studio for 20 minutes, and that's what it is, it's 20 minutes. I mean, yeah, I don't take the parts where they're like, oh, is that enough, or, you know, can I stop now, or whatever. But any time that all of a sudden where I've put the thing like, bang, the camera's rolling, it's part of that database. So nothing gets excluded.
Yeah, I wanted to ask another question about your database. I think all the faces you showed were right, and they're all the same kind of age group. I'm wondering if that was a conscious decision about the types of faces you chose as representations of emotions. I'd like to know Hugo's thoughts on how people empathise according to race and age and things like that, and whether it's an issue you want to address in the work as well.
Well, yeah, I've just written an application, which I don't think I've got, but it would have been great to have got, which was going to many different countries to create a database that truly was universal, and also different ways of expressing, you know, sadness through, you know, talking in their own language, probably. I'd love to address that. I guess the problem is time and also budget for this stage of this project, of being able to get there and shoot it and get the people together, but it would be really fantastic to do. At the BAMP Centre, you tend to get, I mean, there's a lot of Canadians, I guess. There was, yes, it's mostly white. Basically, you're trying to, you know, you might ask, you know, 50 people to come in and, you know, 15 will do it. So it really, it's who walks in the studio in the end. You know, I would love it to be a lot more people, and hopefully this year I'm going back to start the database in June again for the next session. So hopefully we'll, you know, get a lot more of different people, different ages.
Can I ask you to say something on that as well? With the kind of relationship between age and ethnicity and contagion and empathy with emotions.
With I mean, broadly speaking, there's been a real problem which has only recently been addressed in the last 15 years, getting ethnically diverse stimuli used widely in psychology, particularly of things like facial expression. The studies that have looked at influence of I don't know, race perception and so a number of American studies, imaging studies, for example, looking at brain activity associated with perceiving emotions in different ethnic groups, tend to hint at something that could be used to illustrate sort of clear prejudice, if you like, in the brains of the people you're scanning. But ultimately, I think it's a kind of proximity and familiarity with the people. It's almost like, you know, how related are you to the stimuli, and people react more empathically to people that look most similar to them, I think, broadly speaking.
I'm sorry if I've missed the obvious, and I may have done, but I think I understood you to say that the emotional states that you're logging and you make to a database will somehow drive the video or a video or videos that you see. I'm just trying to understand how that happens and what you will see.
So I guess a lot of people create video engines that might randomly trigger a video or something like that. So what we have is mind reading technology, which I might have going here, potentially. Okay, so it's on me now. Do you see?
So you're not
Oh, I'm not plugged in. So basically, the software will assess the viewer and how they're feeling, and then that goes into the video engine. And then with Chris Frith, who's a social neuroscientist based at the Wellcome department over in Queen Square in London, he's hypothesised this sort of idea of how we transfer emotional states. So if I'm feeling angry, what will you feel? And if your response is sadness, then what will I feel? Do you know what I mean? So I guess it's this idea of creating a... well, he's sort of called it a bit closing the loop, hasn't he? Yeah. So how can we get through these heightened emotional states to walk away?
That's rubbish.
Both, both feeling...
Sorry,
It's really been interesting over the last, trying to work this out, and it's not, there still needs to be a lot more work done on it, but I always get that I'm angry most of the time, whereas the programmer, and I'm writing to him, do you get angry? Are you angry all the time? And he goes, I'm happy. I always get happy. And then the other one's always getting sad. So, because you know your computer face when you're intensely looking at something. So, and then also, you can see everything going through here is, I've stopped at the moment. Oh no, I'm back. Is how do you make sense of that? So we're a little, we're so much happy, we're so much neutral, we're so much surprised, we're so much disgust. Yeah, so is now, sitting down with most likely Chris Frith and trying to, and also the guys over at MIT. I'm working with Ros Bacard and Raina El Kalabi over there, is now trying to make more sense out of this. So basically, it looks at you and then makes with this generated code, this hypothesis of emotional exchanges, which we've mapped out. But that's an hypothesis. So then now that's in last year in June, that went back into the lab and we tested those out. If you were shown this video, what would your response be? And so then we've worked with the HCI guys at the Human Computer Interaction Centre at UCL to test that. And then that generates the next form of code. But there's another part of this, which again is coming into the Lighthouse Commission in July, is taking that code a little bit further. Because when we interact and have an empathic response, we don't necessarily, it's not just a matter of you're feeling this and not feeling that. What we have is memory, what you've last done, and also desire, where we want it to go. So I'm working with another neuroscientist up at the Institute of Neurology to develop learning algorithms. So over time, the piece develops moods intensely by that program, by the algorithm. So if someone walks in and they've had a day of everyone being quite bored, over time the whole exhibition will become quite bored, and you'd need someone with a pretty vivacious emotional sort of attitude to try and make that exhibition interesting again. So we're looking, I guess that goes from emotional response, which turns into mood, which I guess after a while starts turning into temperament.
Could I ask a quick question about the code? Because you mentioned in your description then that you developed kind of algorithms and codes and things that are going to be involved in programming. Is there any aesthetic element to the coding? How sort of intelligent is the coding in that sense of making an aesthetic judgment about what's being recorded and presented, or is it purely kind of based on a reductive sort of logic?
Well, the code is being completely driven by the evaluations and also the HCI experiments, evaluations, and also the what Chris Frith thinks. He's had a lot of many years in social neuroscience. He's a pretty amazing man actually. So he's basically putting forward, we're testing it out, he's driving it. So we have days where the programmer sits down, we all sit down and try and speak each other's language. I'm generally the interpreter, and trying to get, you know, I'm now working with a guy called Jeff Mann over in Berlin, and basically to get everyone understanding each other. And that's probably one of the most difficult jobs. So
we've also talked though, haven't we, about the idea of the program at some point being adaptive and sort of learning.
Yeah,
so
that's where I'm talking about
thing.
mood.
But that will be another stage.
That's starting to happen in March here.
I do know of other algorithms that do things like pick out the most important bit of a visual scene, and you can put pictures through that to identify and allegedly optimize the focus of what's displayed on a complex visual scene.
Does it have different algorithms for men and women?
I don't know. No, I mean, I haven't played around with it. I know the guy that develops it. Yeah.
There's someone who's been waiting very patiently to ask a question.
Thank you. I'm quite interested in the information that's being visualised in the background. Whoops, we lost it.
Oh, sorry.
Do you mind giving a live demonstration of what some of these graphs represent, if you can? Is that possible to do?
Well, I guess it's happening now, actually.
Yeah, well, so
It is,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Can you read these? This is head nod, head shake, persistent head forward, persistent head back. And you've got head turns right, left, smile, pucker, and is that lip depression? Eyebrow raise.
Corner depress, yeah.
Yeah. And then happy, sad, neutral, surprised, disgusted, angry, being tracks.
Okay, I just couldn't read them from there.
Yeah.
And then here, which
They did give
basically
auditory feedback, didn't they?
yeah, they do have auditory feedback, which is something that we might bring into it as well, is tracking the intonation and making choices out of that. I've got another residence. Well, I'll be over with MIT, working with them for another month, I think, in June or something like that. So we'll be making it a little bit.
After
more
she's finished
functional.
at Lighthouse, don't worry.
Oh, yeah.
So, do you think it's possible to factor in deceit? I mean, it's like a mind reader program, yeah? So could it tell you how you feel even if you didn't know it? Or
Is Harry still here? Harry? You're a good one on deceit, aren't you? What do you think?
It depends on, if you're talking about deceit, whether it's
well, I'll pretend to be happy, and then it will know that I'm full of shit.
No, obviously, this is not my program, so I couldn't tell you the precise ins and outs of it. But
would it be in theory impossible to measure?
It would be quite, I think it would be quite easy to fool a machine, whereas it would be probably more difficult to fool a person. I think there's always what they call leakage, if that makes any sense.
There's like little things that you do that you
So you might have, for instance, if you're suppressing emotions, you might have squelched facial expressions. You might even have micro expressions, which would be short. So there's loads of deceit. Always gives itself away. But I'd be very impressed if a computer program could figure that out. Whereas I bet Hugo could without a
With smiling, there's this notion of Duchenne and non-Duchenne smiles. Duchenne smiles being the automatic emotional smile, and non-Duchenne ones being the kind of false smile of Tony Blair and people like that. You know, so fixed smiles, and the time course of, you know, the smile onset and offset varies according to the authenticity and kind of the emotional drive towards these expressions.
With this interface, what do you think the balance is between perception and reception? So perception being that comes from the viewer projected onto the view that's come in, and that that's being sort of received.
I guess the whole point of this project was exploring empathy. So both was quite equal. Where that gets, I mean, empathy is, you know, as Harry said, to try and get this working on a computer is really difficult, and so hence you could do this project for 5 years, you know, to really get something that, you know, and then, you know, getting those timings exactly right. Part of the next month's work is working, when is the best time to, when is the time after you've seen a clip that you make the strongest expression, and when after that do you want to hear a response, when do you want to see a response. But then if you've got video clips that need to run their course, do you know what I mean? So getting those lengths and editing right about how long, you know, people should speak for, it's difficult.
I think we've got time for one more question. Is that? Yeah. Oh, sorry, Anna. Or maybe two.
I'm interested in the art science multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary idea. I think I can get a sense of you as an artist asking questions of the science and that taking you places. I'm interested to know how has the science perhaps changed its questions through working with an artist, other than it getting richer material to, or has it?
Has it? I mean, it's benefited tremendously, not only from the. I guess scientists tend to focus in their own little world and work on their thing, and broadening it out in order to increase the explanatory power of what you do to some extent, but also, I mean, certainly my science has been enriched by the collaborations brought on board through Tina's more expansive interactions with scientists and others around the place, particularly in UCL. But obviously there's a direct immediate benefit of higher quality stimuli, more interesting questions to some extent come out of the collaboration as well. You know, you can pursue a line of work that ultimately kind of disengages itself a bit from the kind of purpose of what you're getting at least in my field of emotional stuff. Emotional neuroscience can be very singular, and in fact, you know, a purpose of emotion is to interact socially and communicate socially, and that social dimension is certainly something that has developed through or been feeding off these types of interactions, this art science interaction. And there's a broader need anyway for scientists to communicate to other scientists, but also to the broader audience and the public that fund scientific research councils, what they're doing, why they're doing, and showing that it has at least a product and a purpose. And I think certainly I've benefited from the better language and clearer illustrations of what I'm trying to do.
I also think over on the software side, the software you're developing as well can be utilised in scientific experiments as well. So I guess that's why this is sort of done stage by stage, is that people, you know, you can pull off different bits. Okay, I need that bit to work with this experiment over here, and that bit to work over here. So it's a yeah, it's an interesting relationship.
You mentioned you played a role between, I can't remember where, was it Canada and Berlin, trying to help people talk the same language. I thought that was interesting.
Well, that's what you really end up doing. You spend a lot of your time trying to get people to understand each other, and you're pretty much the conduit for it. Everything tends to, you know, go through you, and you're trying to put it in a language that everyone can understand. And I guess that's part of being, you know, someone who works interdisciplinarily and in media arts, is a lot of my time is spent doing it. And it's good, it's interesting. And then out of that, people, you know, new collaborations are made without me in it, which is also really good.
Anna?
It's not entirely a question, it's sort of a question. Have you come across Pia Tika's Inactive Cinema engine?
Yeah, I've met Pia a couple of times in Finland, and we've always had a good chat, and we've always emailed each other a bit. about what each other's up to, and you know what technology she's working with and what I'm working with and stuff. I haven't actually seen her work exhibited, but Pia, she tends to work a lot more with, you know, with the sweat and with the heart rate, and which is again something that I'm not giving up. But the thing is that it's incredibly complex to be able to.
I think what's interesting is that she has to impose, because she's working from, I don't know if people have seen the work, but she's working from a film director's perspective rather than a specific an artist's perspective, it's a film director's perspective. And so the emotional responses of the audience through the galvanic sensors and the heart rate monitors, etc., drive the narrative of the cinema experience. And so they're not supposed to know that they're being monitored for one point. So they're just, their emotional responses kind of just drive it. And the second point is that she's got complete control over how those responses drive it. So it's the kind of, rather than the generative, it is generative, but she's put her author role on it as well. It's quite interesting kind of.
I mean, I guess in some ways I do as well. I mean, I'm still using video databases, but how I affect them, I have no control over it. So I've got a, you know, a set, and they're usually the live effects that I would use would be the same types of effects that I would use if I was using Final Cut Pro. I don't tend to use any, you know, I've got sort of my set sort of feel. I guess the difference. Oh God, I was just on a tangent then, but now I've forgotten. It's getting late. I was going to talk about. Anyway, I forget. I'll get back to you on it though when I remember. Sorry.
Just one quick question from me. I mean, the software, as you say, it's an infinite project. Do you think there's a point where, you know, we're producing the pieces that it's going to get frustrating that the software isn't working as well as it might?
Software is always frustrating.
Sure. But
that's just what it does. It
given some of the things that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, what you want it to do and what it can do is always a process of frustrating. You put it out there, and then it's a matter of saying, well, this is what we can do with it. And I think where it gets more interesting, which I'd probably say after this project, and I'll go back to the psychophysiology, the sweat and the heart rate, is when it gets into multimodal. You know, where we look at this, we look at how we're walking, we're looking at sweat, hope, or whatever, without being touched in some sort of way, and using that information together intelligently with, you know, making sense of that data in a way that makes sense to the body, rather than, you know, oh, it's registered 80%, so therefore that means that, but actually really understanding what all that information means together, and then we'll get a really good sense of how people are feeling. So I guess that it comes down to multimodal. So it'd be probably the next ones would be bringing in all the past stuff. At the moment, I'm working with Nokia on a project of prosody, and then with another bunch of linguists, computer linguists, on a project about how we structure language and how that makes sense of thought. So a lot of my projects are all the same. I mean, basically asking the same question but in different ways.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just like to say thank you to Helen, Tina and Hugo